starship Valiant floated in the darkness of space above a broken moon called Krell 9, and its metal body showed damage from 3 long weeks of fighting without rest, and Captain Jake Morrison stood on the command bridge staring at screens that showed enemy positions with eyes that had not known real sleep in days, and the alien force called the Zathran Swarm had pushed humanity to the edge of total destruction, and every single day brought terrible news of another human colony burning and another defense fleet scattered into cosmic dust and dying screams. Lieutenant Amy Collins sat at her station, monitoring the sensor arrays, and her fingers moved across holographic controls with practiced efficiency, when suddenly every alarm on her console began screaming warnings into the quiet bridge, and she felt her heart jump into her throat as impossible readings flooded her displays, and she called out to the captain with a voice that tried hard not to shake with fear or excitement, or maybe both at once. "Captain, we are detecting something strange, and the energy signature does not match anything in our entire database of known technologies from any species we have ever encountered in all of human space." Exploration Jake turned from the viewport where he had been watching the stars and moved toward her station with quick steps, and his combat boots made soft sounds on the metal deck plating. And before he could ask what she meant or demand more details, the impossible happened right before their eyes and made everyone on the bridge stop breathing. For several long seconds, space itself seemed to tear open like fabric ripping along invisible seams, and something emerged from that wound in reality, and it was not a normal starship built from steel and circuitry and human engineering, and instead it looked like something between a living creature and a vessel from ancient myths, and its hull flowed with silver lines that moved like water and crystalline. Towers rose from its surface, humming with power that felt older than human civilization itself. Then they saw her, and every single person on the bridge froze in their tracks and forgot how to form words. She stood on top of the strange vessel in the vacuum of space without any protective suit or helmet, and she was tall and impossibly graceful with pointed ears that swept back from her head, and her face looked like it had been carved from moonlight by an artist who understood beauty in ways humans never could, and her armor seemed to be woven from actual starlight that moved and flowed across her body like living metal, and her eyes were amber-colored and vast and ancient, and they looked at the human ship with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been pity. Beside her, coiled around one of the crystal towers, was a dragon, and not some small creature from old Earth fairy tales, but a massive beast as large as a human corvette warship, and its scales shifted through colors that human language had no names for, and smoke curled from its nostrils, and its eyes burned with intelligence that was both terrifying and somehow comforting at the same time. The communication systems crackled to life without anyone on the human side activating them, and her voice came through the speakers like bells ringing in a thunderstorm, and like music that could make mountains weep. "Humans of Earth, and I am Lyra Silverwing of the Fey Dominion, and this magnificent creature. Beside me is my companion, whose name is Ember, and we received your distress beacon, and the one that your ancestors sent out into the void 3,000 years ago, when your species was young and afraid." Jake felt his mouth fall open and his mind struggled to process what she had just said. And 3,000 years ago, humans were barely forming the first civilizations on Earth, and they definitely did not have the technology to send signals into deep space. 3,000 years. And how is that even possible? And we did not have that technology back then. The elf woman tilted her head, and her long silver hair moved in a way that should not have been possible in the airless vacuum, and she smiled sadly. "Your species was once our ally, in ages past when the stars were younger, and we taught your forebears the secrets of working metal and growing crops and creating written language so your knowledge would not die with each generation. And then the great silence came and swept across the galaxy like a wave of darkness, and we thought you lost to time itself and erased from existence, but it seems you survived against all odds and found your way to the stars on your own strength and your own determination." She paused, and her expression grew more serious, and the dragon behind her shifted restlessly, and small wisps of flame escaped from between its teeth. "Though perhaps you did not reach the stars in time to face what now hunts you through the darkness." Jake felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold of space, and he looked at his crew and saw the same mixture of hope and fear reflected on every face, and humanity had been fighting alone for so long, and losing ground every day. And now this being from legends and myths was offering help. But could they trust her, and did they have any choice? Amy Collins spoke up from her station, and her voice was stronger now as the initial shock began to wear off. If you are truly here to help us, then we need to talk, and we need to establish protocols and figure out how we can work together. Against the Zathran, Lyra nodded once, and the gesture was both regal and approving. I agree completely, and send coordinates for a meeting, and my companion and I will come aboard your vessel. And we have much to discuss and much to teach you if you are willing to learn from those who walked among stars when your world was still young. And we will honor the ancient alliance even if you do not remember it yourselves. The communication channel closed, and Jake looked around at his bridge crew and saw determination replacing fear on their faces. And Colonel Lisa Warren stepped forward from her position at the tactical station. And she was a veteran of 20 years of military service, and she had seen things that would break most people. But even she looked shaken, sir. And do we trust this? And she waves her hand toward the viewport, where the silver vessel hung in space, with the elfin dragon still visible on its surface. Jake thought about all the colonies they had lost and all the people who had died screaming into the void as Zathran weapons tore through their ships and homes. And he thought about the fact that humanity was maybe 6 months away from complete extinction at their current rate of losses. We do not have much choice. And if she wanted us dead, we would already be debris floating in space. And besides, and something about her felt true and honest in a way I cannot explain. He turned to Amy, and his voice took on the commanding tone that had kept his crew alive through dozens of impossible battles. Send the coordinates, and prepare the main conference room and make it suitable for a guest, who is apparently older than human civilization. And let us see if ancient legends can save us from modern nightmares. The crew moved to obey, and their actions quick and efficient. Despite the strangeness of the situation, and through the viewport, the silver vessel began to move closer, and the dragon spread its enormous wings, and they caught light from distant stars, and reflected it in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Jake Morrison stood alone for a moment, and watched their approach, and wondered what his ancestors had been like when they first met these beings 3,000 years ago. And had they been as desperate then as humanity was now? And had they felt this same mixture of hope and terror at beings who commanded powers beyond understanding? The Valiant had been humanity's last hope, and now that hope had a name and silver hair and amber eyes and a dragon that could probably destroy their entire ship with one breath. And in that moment, Jake decided that whatever happened next would determine the fate of every human being alive in the galaxy. The elf woman called Lyra landed on their hull with her dragon and requested permission to board, and Jake gave that permission, knowing that everything was about to change and that the war against the Zathran had just taken a turn that no one could have predicted, and whether that turn led to salvation or something else entirely remained to be seen, but they would face it together. The meeting room on the Valiant had been prepared in a hurry, and crew members had cleared away tactical maps and weapon schematics, and someone had even tried to make the cold metal space look more welcoming, though it still smelled like recycled air and burned circuits from the last battle. And Captain Jake Morrison stood near the entrance with his senior officers arranged behind him in a formation that tried to look professional, despite their exhaustion and the strangeness of what was about to happen. The door opened with a soft hiss, and Lyra Silverwing entered the room, and every human present felt their breath catch in their throats, because seeing her on a view screen was one thing, but having her physically present was something else entirely. And she stood nearly 7 feet tall and moved with a grace that made trained soldiers feel clumsy and awkward by comparison. And her skin had a faint glow to it, like she carried starlight beneath the surface, and her armor responded to her movements like it was part of her body rather than something she wore. Behind her, through the still open door, they could see her dragon Ember, and the massive creature had curled itself around the outside of the ship, and one enormous eye watched them through the viewport with an intelligence that felt deeply unsettling, and that eye was larger than a human, and the pupil contracted and expanded as it studied each person in the room individually. Jake stepped forward and extended his hand in the traditional human greeting, and Lyra looked at it for a moment as if accessing memories from thousands of years ago, and then she took his hand, and her grip was firm, and her skin felt warm, and somehow electric. Captain Morrison, and It is good to finally meet face to face, and your vessel is impressive for such a young species. And you have come far in the centuries since we last walked among your people. Her voice in person was even more remarkable than it had been over the communication system, and it had layers to it like multiple instruments playing in harmony, and Jake found himself having to focus to remember he was supposed to be conducting a military negotiation. Please sit. And we have much to discuss about the Zathran threat and how we might coordinate our efforts. Lyra settled into a chair that looked far too small for her frame, but she made it work with that impossible grace, and her eyes swept across the gathered humans and took in every detail with the kind of attention that came from centuries of reading people and situations. Colonel Lisa Warren stood near the tactical display, and she was the chief tactical officer, and a veteran of more battles than she cared to remember. And she had seen too many friends die and attended too many funerals, and this fairy tale figure was supposed to be their salvation. And Lisa had learned long ago not to trust things that seemed too good to be true. She noticed the blade at Lyra's hip, and it hung in a sheath that looked ridiculously small and delicate and completely useless for any real combat. And the sheath itself was maybe 8 inches long and ornate with designs that hurt to look at too closely. And Lisa had spent 20 years studying weapons and warfare, and that thing looked like a decoration, rather than an actual tool of war. The colonel crossed her arms and knew she should probably keep her mouth shut. But exhaustion and frustration and 3 weeks of watching good people die made her reckless. No offense intended, but is that supposed to help us against the Zathran? And is that a toothpick or some kind of ceremonial decoration? The room went completely silent, and several junior officers looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor, and Lieutenant Amy Collins closed her eyes and shook her head slightly, and even Jake felt his stomach drop because insulting a powerful alien who might be their only hope seemed like a spectacularly bad idea. Lyra turned her amber eyes toward Lisa, and for just a moment there was something ancient and terrible in that gaze, and something that remembered when stars were young, and humanity had not yet learned to make fire, and when beings far more powerful than the Zathran had ruled the galaxy and been forgotten by time, and Lisa felt a cold finger of genuine fear trace down her spine. Then the elf woman smiled, and it was not a friendly expression, but rather something sharp and dangerous like broken glass. Catching light, a demonstration then, and perhaps words alone will not suffice to explain what you are dealing with. Lyra stood in one fluid motion, and her hand moved to the small sheath at her hip, and every human in the room tensed without quite knowing why, and some deep instinct screamed warnings that their conscious minds could not articulate. She drew the blade. What emerged from that modest sheath made physics itself seem like a polite suggestion rather than a law, and the weapon extended and unfolded and grew and transformed from something knife-sized into a greatsword that was 7 feet long and wreathed in flames that did not burn the air, and crackling with energy that made every instrument on the ship start screaming warnings and alarms, and the blade sang, and the sound resonated in the bones of every person present and made their teeth ache, and the air around it bent and twisted like reality could not quite handle its presence. Lyra held it one-handed as easily as a human might hold a pencil, and there was no strain in her posture and no effort visible in her stance, and the flames danced along the blade in colors that should not exist, and the sword seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. This is Starfall, and it was forged in the heart of a dying sun by my great-grandmother, who was ancient, when your species first looked up at the night sky and wondered what was beyond. And this blade has ended civilizations that thought themselves gods and toppled empires that spanned thousands of worlds. She moved with casual precision and touched the tip of Starfall to the reinforced steel conference table, and the metal simply ceased to exist, and not cut or melted or burned, but unmade on a fundamental level, and a perfect circular hole appeared that went down through the table and through the deck plating below, and through 2 more decks after that, and alarms began blaring throughout that section of the ship as atmosphere started venting into space before emergency seals kicked in. Lyra lifted the blade and it stopped making holes in the ship, and she held it up so the light played across its impossible surface. My companion Ember can burn entire worlds to ash with her breath and reduce mountains to molten glass and boil oceans into steam. And I have walked battlefields for 6 centuries and seen empires rise and fall and watched species go extinct, and been present at the births of new stars. The sword began to shrink and fold back in on itself, and within seconds it was knife-sized again, and Lyra slid it back into that small sheath with a soft click that sounded very loud in the silent room. Your doubt is natural. Colonel Warren and fear makes us question everything and everyone, and it is a survival instinct that has kept your species alive through countless dangers, and I do not fault you for it. She looked directly at Lisa, and her expression had softened somewhat, though her eyes still held that vast, ancient quality. But do not mistake our appearance for weakness, and do not assume that, because we look different or use technology that seems like magic to you, that we are somehow less capable than your warriors. And we survived the wars that made the darkness between stars, and we fought in conflicts that predated your sun, and we can survive this too. Lisa swallowed hard and felt her face burning with embarrassment and shame. And she had seen a lot in her military career, but nothing had prepared her for having her assumptions shattered so completely and thoroughly. Ma'am, and I apologize, and that was unprofessional and disrespectful, and I spoke without thinking. Lyra waved a hand dismissively, and her expression became almost gentle. No need for apologies. And I have lived long enough to understand that fear and doubt are twin siblings that walk hand in hand. And you have lost people recently, and I can see it in your eyes, and you are afraid to hope, because hope has been taken from you too many times. She turned to address the entire room, and her voice took on a formal quality that felt like an oath being sworn. Know this, and when we Fae make a pledge, we keep it for eternity, and our word is binding across time and space, and your ancestors helped us once when we were young and weak and fleeing from something terrible, and they gave us sanctuary and taught us kindness when we knew only fear, and now we return that favor. 1,000-fold, Jake found his voice again and stepped forward with renewed confidence. What do you need from us, and how can we coordinate our forces against the Zathran? Lyra smiled, and this time it was genuine and warm. First, and you need to understand what you are truly fighting, and the Zathran are not just another hostile species, and they are a hive mind that has consumed hundreds of civilizations, and they see all other life as either food or obstacles, and they cannot be reasoned with or negotiated with, and they must be stopped completely, or they will devour everything. Amy Collins leaned forward from her station, and her analytical mind was already processing the implications. You said your people received our distress beacon from 3,000 years ago, and why did it take so long for you to respond? The elf woman's expression grew sad and distant. Because we were fighting our own war against something far worse than the Zathran, and a war that nearly destroyed the Fae Dominion entirely. And we have only recently emerged from that conflict, and found ourselves changed and diminished but still alive. And when we finally checked our old beacon network, we found your signal and realized that the Zathran attacked the mining colony at Ceres 3 days after the meeting, and they came with overwhelming force that blotted out the stars, and 15 massive hive ships emerged from hyperspace, each one stretching a full kilometer of chitinous armor and biological horror, and they began vomiting thousands upon thousands of drone fighters into the black void, like a swarm of angry insects, and each drone carried enough firepower to cripple a human destroyer. The human defense fleet scrambled to intercept, and 12 destroyers and the Valiant moved into defensive positions around the colony, and the civilian station held 10,000 miners and their families and support staff, and they had nowhere to run and no time to evacuate, and Commander Nina Price watched from the Valiant bridge as tactical displays showed the hopeless mathematics of the engagement. We are outnumbered 15-1 in capital ships, and the drones number in the tens of thousands, and at best we can hold them for maybe 20 minutes before they break through. Our lines, Jake Morrison gripped the arms of his command chair and watched the Zathran formation advance with the terrible inevitability of a cosmic avalanche, and he had faced impossible odds before, but never anything like this. And he opened his mouth to give orders that would only delay the inevitable when Amy Collins shouted from her sensor station, "Captain, and new contact, and it is the Fae vessel, and she is coming in fast," and very fast. Space tore open, and the silver ship burst through reality like a knife through silk, and Lyra Silverwing stood on its spine completely unprotected in the vacuum, and her armor kept her alive through means that human science could not begin to explain. And she looked like an ancient war goddess come to pass judgment on those who dared threaten her allies. Ember launched from the ship with a roar that somehow transmitted through the soundless void, and the sound bypassed physics entirely. and resonated directly in the minds of every living thing within 1,000 kilometers, and space itself seemed to catch fire. The dragon was magnificent and terrible in equal measure, and her wings spread wide enough to cast shadows on the nearby asteroids, and her scales reflected light that had never touched them, and her eyes burned with intelligence and fury that was older than human history. The first wave of Zathran drones turned toward this new threat, and thousands of weapons locked onto the dragon and fired in unison, and energy beams and kinetic rounds and biological acid streams all converged on Ember in a display of firepower that should have atomized anything living. The dragon breathed. What came from her mouth was not fire, and not exactly, and it was something older and more fundamental than mere combustion, and it was the concept of transformation made manifest, and the essence of change given physical form, and where it touched the Zathran drones, they did not explode or melt or burn. They transformed metal and chitin, and biological components changed into flowers that bloomed for one instant in the void before dispersing into cosmic dust. And some drones became pure musical notes that rang through space, on frequencies that should not exist, and others transformed into light itself and scattered across the spectrum in colors that human eyes could not process, and a few became concepts rather than physical things, and they were ideas of peace and rest and ending, and they simply stopped being. The Zathran hive ships registered something they had never experienced in thousands of years of conquest, and it was fear. Lyra moved, and she was faster than light should allow, and faster than human sensors could track properly, and she leaped from her ship with starfall extending to its full 7 feet of impossible glory, and the blade blazed with power that made nearby stars seem dim by comparison. She fell toward the nearest hive ship like a meteor made of starlight and wrath, and she drove starfall into its hull with both hands, and the blade sank into the organic metal like it was wet paper, and then she pulled. The hive ship came apart along lines that followed no natural physics, and it did not explode but rather unfolded, like origami in reverse, and its component parts drifted away peacefully as if they had never been assembled in the first place, and 10,000 Zathran drones connected to that ship simply died as their mother vessel ceased to exist. Ember circled and breathed again, and another hive ship transformed into something that looked like a massive flower made of crystal and light, before it shattered into 1 billion harmless fragments. The human fleet watched in stunned silence as two beings rewrote the rules of warfare right before their eyes. Nina Price stood at her tactical station with her mouth hanging open, and she had been trained at the finest military academies humanity had to offer, and she had studied every recorded battle in human history, and none of it had prepared her for this. They are not just fighting, and they are conducting a symphony of destruction, and every move is perfect and precise, and the Zathran cannot even touch them. Jake nodded slowly and watched as Lyra used her silver ship like a surfer riding a wave, and the vessel responded to her thoughts rather than controls, and she guided it through the enemy formation while starfall carved impossible patterns through ships that had terrified humanity for months. The Zathran tried to adapt, and they were a hive mind, and they learned quickly, and they began coordinating their attacks and focusing fire and attempting to predict Lyra's movements. And for a moment it seemed like they might succeed through sheer weight of numbers. Then Ember showed them what a dragon who had lived for centuries could really do. The massive creature folded her wings and dove straight into the densest concentration of enemy ships, and her body began to glow from within like she had swallowed a sun, and the temperature around her rose to levels that melted nearby asteroids into slag. She exploded outward. It was not a destructive explosion, but rather an expansion of pure, transformative energy, and it radiated out in a sphere that encompassed 5 hive ships and 2,000 drones, and everything it touched changed. The Zathran vessels became gardens floating in space, and forests of crystalline trees and meadows of flowers that had never existed on any world, and for just a moment there was beauty, where before there had been only horror. Then the gardens faded and dispersed and left nothing but empty space where the Zathran had been. The remaining hive ships made a decision that had never been recorded in any human database of Zathran behavior, and they ran, and they turned and fled back toward hyperspace with a panic that transcended their hive mind programming, and for the first time in their history, they had encountered something more powerful than themselves, and it terrified them. But one hive ship had been crippled by a human missile barrage before the retreat order came, and it was dying, and its systems failing, and in its death throes it did what all wounded predators do, and it lashed out at the nearest prey. The ship activated its kinetic bombardment system and launched a chunk of moon rock that had been hollowed out and filled with dense metals and accelerated it to a significant fraction of light speed and aimed it directly at the mining colony. The projectile was massive and moving faster than human weapons could intercept, and it would hit Ceres Station in exactly 30 seconds and turn 10,000 people into superheated plasma alarms, screamed across every human ship, and voices shouted over communication channels, and parents on the station grabbed their children, and some people prayed and others simply held each other and waited for the end. Lyra saw it and calculated distances and velocities in a fraction of a second, and she knew she was too far away, and her ship could not close the gap in time. And Ember was recovering from her last attack, and there was no time. So she did something that would become legend. The elf woman planted her feet on her ship's hull, and she bent her knees, and she jumped and pushed off with strength that should have torn the vessel apart, and she launched herself across empty space toward the incoming projectile. She flew through the void like an arrow of light, and her armor protected her from the impossible speeds and the crushing acceleration, and she held Starfall before her with both hands, and the blade sang its bone-deep song of power and ending. The projectile was the size of a small building and moving at relativistic speed, and Lyra was one person with one sword, and the mathematics said it was impossible. She met the projectile with an upward slash. Starfall connected with the massive chunk of rock and metal, and reality itself seemed to pause for just a moment, as if the universe was holding its breath, and then the blade cut. The projectile did not split, or shatter, or break apart, and instead it simply stopped existing and converted directly into harmless photons that dispersed across every wavelength, and the deadly kinetic strike became nothing more than a brief flash of light that was actually quite beautiful. Lyra's momentum carried her toward the colony, and she had no way to stop or change direction, and she was going to hit the station hull at speeds that would turn her into paste despite her armor. Ember was there. The dragon appeared beside her rider in a burst of displaced space, and wrapped one massive claw gently around Lyra's body and arrested her momentum with careful precision, and the elf woman looked up at her companion and smiled with genuine affection and relief. "Thank you, old friend." And that was closer than I would have preferred. The dragon rumbled something that might have been amusement or might have been a gentle scolding, and she carried Lyra down to the colony hull, where the elf woman drove Starfall into the metal to anchor. The war continued for 3 long months after the Battle of Ceres, and every week brought new attacks and new desperate defenses, and Lyra Silverwing and her dragon Ember became something more than allies to humanity, and they became a legend that spread across every human colony and outpost and station in occupied space. Children drew pictures of the silver-haired elf woman with her impossible sword, and soldiers painted dragons on their ships for luck and hope. And whenever the Zathran attacked in force, there was always the same prayer whispered across communication channels, and please let the Fae come, and please let them arrive in time. The Zathran had never encountered a force that made them question their own superiority, and for thousands of years they had swept across the galaxy, consuming everything and converting all biological matter into more of themselves. And they had never retreated, and never hesitated, and never known fear, until now. Every battle followed the same pattern, and the swarm would attack with overwhelming numbers because that was all they knew. And that was their strategy, refined over millennia of conquest. And then space would tear open, and the silver vessel would emerge, and Lyra would stand upon its spine like a war goddess from ancient myths, and Ember would roar that impossible sound that bypassed physics and reached directly into minds, and the Zathran would die in ways that defied understanding. But legends bleed too, and even gods can grow tired. Jake Morrison found Lyra in the observation deck of the Valiant after the brutal engagement at Europa Station, and the battle had lasted 6 hours and claimed 3 human destroyers and 2,000 lives, and the Zathran had lost 12 hive ships and 50,000 drones, but they kept coming, and they always kept coming. The elf woman stood before the massive viewport with her armor retracted down to a simple tunic that looked almost human, and for the first time since Jake had met her, She looked tired, and the glow beneath her skin seemed dimmer, and her shoulders carried a weight that had not been visible before. Outside in the black void, Ember was curled around the silver vessel, and the dragon's scales seemed less vibrant than usual, and her great eyes were closed in something that might have been sleep or might have been exhaustion. Beyond sleep, Lyra spoke without turning, and she had known he was there before the door even opened. "We are not accustomed to this kind of prolonged conflict, Captain Morrison, and my people fight rarely but decisively, and we end wars quickly, with overwhelming force. And then we return to our lives, and our art, and our long contemplation of the universe." She paused, and her hands gripped the railing before the viewport, and Jake noticed that her knuckles were white with tension. This grinding war of attrition, and this endless cycle of battle and recovery, and battle again, and it is wearing on us in ways I did not anticipate, and Ember grows weary, and I grow weary, and still they come. Jake approached carefully, and he had learned over the past months that the Fae valued honesty above politeness, and they respected truth even when it was difficult. "You have saved millions of lives, and probably billions when we account for colonies that would have fallen without your intervention, and humanity owes you a debt we can never repay." Lyra finally turned to look at him, and in her amber eyes, he saw something he had not expected to see in loneliness and the profound isolation that comes from being something so different and so powerful, that others cannot truly understand your existence. "But I cannot save them all, and your weapons barely scratch the Zathrin hull armor, and your ships are so fragile, and your people die so easily." She said it without cruelty, and just stating facts that hurt her to acknowledge. "I watch them fall in every battle, and I see young humans with their whole lives ahead of them turn to ash and vapor, and I cannot be everywhere at once, and even with all my power, and even with Ember's strength, and we cannot shield every ship and intercept every weapon and save every life." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and Jake realized with a shock that she was on the verge of tears, and this being who had lived for centuries and fought in wars before humanity learned to write was struggling with the same guilt and helplessness that every soldier eventually faces. Then, "Teach us, and you said your people taught our ancestors metallurgy and writing and agriculture, and teach us to fight like you do, and teach us to survive." Lyra studied him for a long moment, and her ancient eyes searched his face for something, and sincerity perhaps, or determination, or maybe just the spark of potential that she had seen in humanity 3,000 years ago. "Your species possesses a stubbornness that is both your greatest weakness and your most powerful strength, and you do not know when to give up, and you claw and scratch and fight for every inch of ground even when logic says you should surrender." She smiled then, and it was small and tired, but genuine. "Very well, Captain, and we will teach you what we can, and we will share techniques that the Fae have perfected over thousands of years, and we will show you how to weave your technology with principles that predate your sun." Jake felt hope surge in his chest, and real tangible hope that humanity might actually survive this. "What do we need to do, and what can you teach us?" Lyra turned back to the viewport and gestured at the debris field from the recent battle. "Your ships are built with purely physical principles and metal and circuitry and chemical reactions, and they are impressive for a young species, but they are limited by your understanding of reality." She raised one hand and her fingers traced patterns in the air, and Jake saw faint lines of light follow her movements. "The universe is not as solid as you believe, and matter and energy are not as separate as your science teaches, and there are spaces between spaces and ways to fold distance and methods to make a small ship punch far above its weight." Class. Amy Collins had been working with Lyra's people for weeks now and learning principles that made her engineering degree feel like kindergarten math, and she had returned to the Valiant with eyes that held wonder and frustration in equal measure. "It is like learning to see colors that do not exist, and they show me how to weave crystalline matrices into our hull plating, and how to tune our weapons to frequencies that bypass normal matter. And every time I think I understand, they show me another layer. Beneath Colonel Lisa, Warren had spent her time learning combat techniques from Lyra herself, and the elf woman was patient but demanding, and she pushed Lisa to think beyond 3 dimensions and consider tactics that involved folding space and striking from angles that should not exist. You think in straight lines, Colonel, and you think in terms of distance and time as fixed values, and you must learn to think as reality thinks and fluid, and malleable and responsive to will and intention. Lisa had come away from those sessions with a headache that lasted for days, but also with knowledge that no human military academy could have provided. The Valiant became a testing ground for new hybrid technologies, and human engineers worked alongside projections and recordings that Lyra provided, and they integrated crystalline structures into hull plating and rewired weapon systems according to principles that seemed like magic, but produced measurable results. The first test came 2 weeks later, when a Zathran patrol found a human supply convoy and 6 hive ships moved to intercept what they expected to be easy prey. The convoy was guarded by a single destroyer called the Phoenix, and it had been the first ship retrofitted with the new Fae-influenced technology, and Captain Maria Hayes commanded the vessel, and she had volunteered for this dangerous duty, knowing that failure might doom the entire retrofit program. The Zathran attacked with standard tactics and overwhelming numbers, and they launched drone swarms and fired biological weapons and prepared to watch another human ship die like all the others. The Phoenix lit up. Its hull plating shimmered with crystalline patterns that had not been visible before, and its weapons fired on frequencies that the Zathran had never encountered, and where normally the swarm's adaptive armor would have shrugged off human firepower. These new weapons punched through like the armor did not exist. Maria Hayes stood on her bridge and felt the ship respond to her intent in ways that were almost telepathic, and the Fae modifications had created a connection between captain and vessel that went beyond normal command and control. Target the lead hive ship and all weapons and full synchronized barrage. The Phoenix fired, and 6 different weapon systems that should not have been able to coordinate their fire struck the same point at exactly the same instant, and the combined impact did not just damage the hive ship, and it unmade a section of its hull on a fundamental level. The Zathran ship reeled and its drones scattered in confusion, and the remaining 5 hive ships hesitated for the first time in their existence. Maria smiled, and it was not a kind expression. Now they know what it feels. Like the Phoenix danced through the battle like Lyra had taught their tacticians, and it folded space in small ways, and struck from unexpected angles, and used the Zathran's numbers against them by positioning enemy ships where they would block each other's fire. When Lyra and Ember arrived to assist, they found the convoy intact and the Phoenix heavily damaged but still fighting, and 3 of the 6 hive ships destroyed, and the other 3 in full retreat. The elf woman landed on the Phoenix's hull and walked through the emergency force field into the ship, and she found Maria Hayes bloody and exhausted but grinning. "We did it, and we actually held them off on our own." The Zathran Queen came herself to Terra Nova, and it was humanity's largest remaining colony with 15 million souls living on a terraformed world that had taken 2 centuries to make habitable, and she brought with her the full might of the swarm gathered from across 3 galactic sectors, and 100 massive hive ships materialized in orbit, and behind them came 10 million drone fighters that filled space like a living cloud. And the message was absolutely clear: and surrender now or face complete extinction. But the humans who came to meet her were not the same species. The swarm had been hunting for the past 6 months. The human fleet emerged from behind Terra Nova's moon, and they came in ships that gleamed with crystalline patterns woven into their hulls, and vessels that hummed with power, that bent the rules of physics in small but crucial ways. And every ship had been retrofitted with technology that married human ingenuity with ancient Fae knowledge and weapons, that combined brutal human pragmatism with elegant elven precision. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant, and around him, his crew moved with confidence that came from training and knowledge and hope, and Lieutenant Amy Collins operated systems that responded to thought as much as touch, and Colonel Lisa Warren coordinated tactics that used principles of space-folding and dimensional manipulation that she had learned from a warrior 6 centuries old. The fleet numbered 40 ships, and they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1 in capital vessels, and the drones outnumbered them by factors that made mathematical sense break down, but the humans did not flee and did not hesitate and did not show fear. They had learned from the best high above the fleet in the black void between worlds. Lyra Silverwing stood upon her silver vessel, and Ember coiled beneath her, and the dragon's scales blazed with inner fire that reflected colors impossible to name. and the elf woman held Starfall in both hands, and the blade sang its bone-deep song of power and ending. She opened a communication channel that reached every ship in both fleets. Zathran Queen, and I am Lyra Silverwing of the Fey Dominion, and you have made a grave error in coming here, and these humans are under my protection, and they are allies bound by oaths that predate your species' first stirrings of consciousness. The Queen responded, and her voice was 1,000 voices speaking in perfect unison and a hive mind that spanned billions of individuals speaking as one. You are one, and we are legion, and you have delayed the inevitable, but you cannot stop the swarm, and we will consume this world and these soft creatures, and we will grow stronger from there. Biomass Lyra smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had seen empires fall and stars die, and civilizations rise from nothing. You misunderstand what you face, and these humans have learned, and they have adapted, and they have become something new. And today you will learn what happens when stubbornness meets ancient knowledge. Jake gave the order, and his voice was steady and clear. All ships and engage at will and show them what humanity has become. The battle began. The human fleet moved in patterns that Lyra had taught them, and formations that use space itself as a weapon, and they folded distance and struck from angles that should not exist, and their weapons fired on frequencies that bypassed Zathran adaptive armor and carved through chitin and metal like it was paper. The destroyer Defiance, commanded by Captain Robert Kane, folded space and appeared inside the formation of a hive cluster and fired its entire payload at point-blank range, and 3 Zathran capital ships died before they could react, and the Defiance folded away before return fire could touch it. The cruiser Horizon used crystalline matrices in its hull to absorb incoming fire and redirect the energy back at its attackers, and Zathran drones found their own weapons turned against them. The Valiant coordinated the entire fleet, and Amy Collins had learned to think in 4 dimensions, and she saw patterns in the battle that no purely human mind could have processed, and she guided ships to where they needed to be before they even knew they needed to be there. But it was Lyra who turned the tide. She launched herself from her silver vessel like a meteor of pure intention, and Ember followed with wings that caught starlight and reflected it in patterns that hypnotized and disoriented enemy sensors, and together they dove into the heart of the swarm. Starfall blazed with light that had been forged in dying suns, and the blade carved through hive ships like they were made of smoke and shadows, and everywhere Lyra struck, the Zathran died, and their ships came apart along impossible seams, and their drones transformed into harmless particles that dispersed into the cosmic background. Ember breathed transformation, and entire squadrons of enemy fighters became gardens and music and light and concepts that had no physical form. And the dragon's roar shook space itself and made the Zathran hive mind falter and stutter with something it had never experienced before. True primal fear. The Queen realized that her fleet was being destroyed, and that these humans were not the easy prey she had expected, and that the Fey warrior was carving a path directly toward her flagship, and so she made a decision that changed everything. She left her ship. The Zathran Queen was massive and terrible and beautiful in an alien way, and she was the size of a small spacecraft, and her body was covered in armor that had been grown and refined over thousands of years, and her weapons were biological and deadly, and she had never personally entered combat because she had never needed to, until now. She met Lyra in the void between ships, and 2 ancient beings faced each other in the darkness, with armies fighting and dying around them. The Queen attacked first, and she moved with speed that belied her size, and her claws could cut through starship armor, and her biological weapons could dissolve matter on contact, and she was the apex predator of a species that had conquered hundreds of worlds. Lyra met her with Starfall, and the blade sang. They fought across the hull of the Queen's flagship, and the duel was beyond anything human sensors could properly track, and they moved faster than thought and struck with power that cracked the very fabric of space, and every collision sent shockwaves that damaged nearby vessels of both fleets. The Queen was strong and fast and deadly, and she had evolved specifically to be the perfect warrior and the perfect survivor and the perfect consumer of all other life, but Lyra had been trained by Fey masters who had walked battlefields when the universe was young, and she had fought in wars that the Queen could not imagine, and she carried a blade forged in stellar fire by her great-grandmother, who had been ancient when the Zathran were still learning to build hive ships. The elf woman danced, and every movement was precise and economical and beautiful and deadly, and Starfall wove patterns in the void that told stories of endings and transformations and the fundamental change that comes to all things. The queen struck with claws that could tear through anything, and Lyra was not there, and the elf had folded space around herself and appeared behind her opponent, and Starfall carved a line of light across the queen's armor. The Zathran monarch screamed, and the sound was a psychic wave that stunned every drone in the battle and made human crews clutch their heads in pain. But Lyra pressed forward, and she did not stop, and did not slow, and did not show mercy. This is for every human who died screaming as your swarm consumed their homes, and this is for every colony burned, and every child orphaned, and every life you stole. She struck again and again, and Starfall sang its song of ending. And the queen tried to adapt and tried to evolve and tried to survive, but evolution takes time. And Lyra gave her no time. The final strike came when the queen lunged with desperation and opened herself to attack, and Lyra saw the opening and took it without hesitation, and Starfall pierced the queen's heart, and the blade sank deep and blazed with light, that unmade biological matter on a fundamental level. The queen died. The psychic scream of her death echoed across light years and reached into the mind of every Zathran in the galaxy, and 10 million drones simply stopped in mid-flight, and their connection to the hive mind severed forever, and 100 hive ships went dark and dead as their controlling intelligence ceased to exist. The battle was over. Lyra withdrew Starfall from the queen's corpse, and the massive body drifted in the void and already began to decay as the biological processes that had sustained it failed, and the elf woman stood alone in space, covered in alien blood and exhausted beyond measure. Ember came for her and wrapped gentle claws around her rider and carried her back to the silver vessel, and the dragon rumbled concern and affection. "I am well, old friend, and just tired, and so very tired." The human fleet secured the area and captured or destroyed the now mindless Zathran vessels, and within hours the threat that had nearly destroyed humanity was broken and scattered, and no longer capable of coordinated action. Jake Morrison landed the Valiant on Terra Nova's surface, and he found Lyra standing in the capital city's main plaza, and Ember curled protectively around a fountain, and both of them looked exhausted but peaceful. And around them, humans cheered and cried and celebrated. The captain approached with Amy Collins and Lisa Warren at his side, and all three of them looked battered and tired but alive and grateful. "What happens now, and will you return to your people?" Lyra looked at the humans gathered around her, and saw children who had drawn pictures of dragons and soldiers who had learned to fight like Fey warriors, and engineers who had mastered technologies that should have